Matthias Keller had dreamed of Colombia his whole life, not of the beaches or the coffee, but of freedom, of the possibility of simply being someone else, far away from Dortmund, far away from his failed marriage, far away from the stares of his neighbors, who still whispered when he walked by. At 44, he had finally saved enough to take 2 weeks off. His daughter, Laura, was with her mother. The workshop was running smoothly without him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel guilty about thinking of himself. The flight from Frankfurt to Bogotá was long, but Matthias hardly slept. He stared out the window as the sun rose over the Atlantic and tried to ignore the tingling in his stomach. It wasn't fear, not really. It was anticipation, maybe hope, too. In Bogotá, he had booked a connecting flight to Cartagena, the coastal city described as magical in all the travel blogs. Colonial architecture, the Caribbean Sea, and a vibrancy that he had long since lost in Germany. When he landed at Rafael Núñez Airport, the heat hit him like a wall, humid, oppressive, but somehow inviting. He took a deep breath and smelled salt water, fried empanadas and exhaust fumes. Cartagena was loud. Taxis honked everywhere. Vendors hawked their wares. Music blared from small shops. Matthias immediately felt alive, as if someone had flipped a switch. He had booked a small hotel in Gethsemane, the hip district outside the old town. The streets were adorned with brightly colored street art. Young people sat in cafes, drinking café con leche and laughing about things he didn't understand. No one here spoke German, and that was a good thing. Here no one knew him as the man whose wife had left him for his best friend. Here he was just Matthias, a tourist with a backpack and skin that was far too pale. He spent the first few days exploring the city. He strolled through the winding alleys of the old town, admired the colorful colonial houses with their flower-filled balconies, ate ceviche in small restaurants where the locals smiled at him kindly and tried to give him recommendations in Spanish. He hardly understood a word, but that didn't matter. The gestures, the smiles, the warmth of the people here felt genuine. In the evenings, he often sat in a bar called Donde Fidel, a small shack with plastic chairs and vallenato music blaring from old speakers. The locals drank aguardiente here, an aniseed schnapps that tasted like licorice and burned away all worries after the third glass. Matthias didn't particularly like the taste, but he drank it anyway. It was part of letting go. On the fourth night he met Gabriela. She was sitting at the bar alone, with a glass of rum and coke in front of her. Matthias noticed her immediately, not because she was conspicuous, but because she seemed so calm amid the chaos. She was a plump woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark curls that fell over her shoulders and a face that radiated both tiredness and wisdom. She wore a simple white dress that stretched at the sides and sandals that had seen better days. Matthias didn't know why he dared to speak to her. Maybe it was the aguardiente. Maybe it was the fact that he was thousands of miles from home and had nothing to lose. He slid onto the stool next to her and said in broken Spanish, "Hola, ¿puedo invitarte algo? Can I buy you a drink?" She turned to him, looked him over with dark, inscrutable eyes, and after a long pause that felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Claro," she said. "Why not?" Her voice was deep and soft, almost melodic. She spoke slowly, as if she knew he wouldn't understand everything. Matthias didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Her name was Gabriela. She worked in a kitchen in the old town, and she had moved to Cartagena to escape her family in a small village in the mountains. She didn't say much more, and he didn't ask any further questions. It felt disrespectful to probe a wound that might still be fresh. They drank together, laughed at his terrible pronunciation, and at some point she put her hand on his. Her skin was warm, a little damp with sweat, and Matthias felt a jolt in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had touched him like that. Not by accident, not out of politeness, but on purpose. Around midnight, she asked him if he wanted to come back to her place. She didn't live far, she said, only a 10-minute walk. Matthias didn't hesitate for a second. He paid the bill, and they left the bar together, stepping out into the sultry night of Cartagena. The streets were now almost empty, with only a few stray dogs wandering around, and music still playing somewhere in the distance. Gabriela led him through narrow alleys, past houses whose colors faded in the darkness, until they stopped in front of a small, dilapidated building. The facade was cracked, the plaster was crumbling, and the wooden door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Her apartment was on the first floor, a single room with a bed, a wobbly table, a small stove, and a fan that turned slowly but barely moved the air. It smelled of onions, sweat, and something sweet that Matthias couldn't identify. She didn't apologize for the condition of the apartment, and he respected that. It was her home just as it was. She immediately pulled him toward her, kissing him hard, almost desperately, and Matthias let himself go. He didn't want to think, didn't want to question, just feel. Her hands were everywhere, and he felt his body react, all the loneliness of the last few months discharging in that moment. They made love on the bed, whose mattress was worn out and squeaked with every movement. It wasn't romantic, not like in the movies, but it was real, painfully real. Gabriela was loud, moaning things in Spanish that he didn't understand and clawing at his back. Matthias lost track of time. It felt like hours, but maybe it was only half an hour. When they finally lay exhausted next to each other, the fans spinning uselessly above them, Matthias felt a strange emptiness. Not regret, but not fulfillment either. More like a question. What am I doing here? Gabriela fell asleep quickly, her breathing heavy and steady. Matthias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, where water stains spread like maps, trying to name the feeling that was spreading in his chest. Discomfort. Yes, that was it. A quiet, nagging unease that he couldn't explain. Towards morning, when the first light fell through the narrow window, he woke up and felt it immediately. Itching. A burning, unbearable itching in his genital area. He sat up, his heart suddenly pounding faster, and carefully pulled back the thin blanket. What he saw made his blood run cold. His skin was reddened, swollen, and in the folds where sweat and moisture had collected, he saw movement. Tiny, white, worm-like things wriggling. Larvae. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They crawled over his skin. Some had already burrowed into his pores. Matthias screamed, a shrill, panicked scream that woke Gabriela from her sleep. She stared at him, then at his abdomen, and her face changed. No surprise, no horror, just a cold, empty calm. She said nothing, just got up, got dressed, and left the room. Matthias remained behind, trembling, whimpering, desperately trying to scratch the larvae off his skin. But the more he scratched, the deeper they seemed to burrow. He felt panic completely overwhelm him, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. He was alone in a strange city, in a language he didn't speak, with a nightmare that had only just begun. The minutes passed like hours. Matthias sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, his gaze fixed on his own body. The larvae continued to move, relentlessly, as if they had a will of their own. He tried to remember if he had read anywhere what to do in such a situation, but his mind was blank, flooded with panic and disgust. The door remained closed. Gabriela did not return. The room suddenly felt much smaller. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the sunlight, now shining brighter through the window, only made everything more cruelly visible. Matthias forced himself to stand up, his legs feeling weak, and stumbled to the small sink in the corner of the room. The water came out as only a thin trickle, lukewarm, and with a metallic smell. He tried to wash off the larvae, rubbing his skin desperately with his hands, but it didn't help. Some of the larvae were washed away and disappeared down the drain, but others clung on, and he felt them penetrating deeper into his flesh. The pain was no longer just an itch, it was a burning, stinging sensation, as if he were being eaten from the inside. Matthias reached for his backpack, which was lying next to the bed, and pulled out his cell phone. His fingers were so wet and shaky that he entered the PIN incorrectly twice. When he finally unlocked it, he desperately searched for the name of his hotel. He had to go back. He had to find help. But how could he explain to someone what had happened? How could he describe in a foreign language that his body was infested with parasites he had contracted from a woman whose last name he didn't even know? He hurriedly got dressed, his clothes sticking to his sweat-drenched skin. Every movement hurt, every step felt like walking on broken glass. He left the apartment without looking back, ran down the stairs, and stumbled out onto the street. The morning sun blinded him, and the city, which had seemed so lively and inviting yesterday, now felt hostile. People passed him on their way to work, and no one noticed his condition, or they looked away. Cartagena was a city accustomed to overlooking things. Matthias stumbled through the streets of Gethsemane, his legs trembling with every step. The morning sun was already beating down mercilessly on the cobblestones, and the heat made everything worse. His t-shirt stuck to his back, soaked with sweat and panic. People streamed past him, women with baskets full of fruit on their heads, men on rickety bicycles, children running to school laughing. No one paid any attention to him. To them, he was just another drunk tourist who hadn't made it through the night. Matthias grabbed every passerby, trying to ask in broken Spanish, "Donde está el hospital? Where is the hospital?" Most shrugged their shoulders or pointed vaguely in different directions. An older man with a straw hat stopped, looked at him with concern, and pointed to a busy street. "Hospital Boca Grande," he said, making a gesture with his hand that probably meant it was far away. Matthias had no idea how far. He had lost all sense of distance, of time, of anything except the burning pain that was now spreading from his groin to his stomach. The larvae weren't just on the surface. He felt something moving inside him, as if they were eating their way through his tissue. The thought almost made his legs buckle. He waved desperately for a taxi. 3 drove by without stopping. When the 4th came along, he almost jumped in front of the car, and the driver slammed on the brakes. Matthias threw open the door and collapsed into the back seat. "Hospital," he gasped. "Por favor, hospital!" The taxi driver, a young man with a gold chain and reggaeton blaring from the speakers, turned around and looked at him. "Estás bien? Are you okay?" Matthias just shook his head, pressed his hands against his stomach and closed his eyes. The driver shrugged, turned on the meter and drove off. The ride felt endless. Cartagena was congested in the morning, cars honking, motorcycles weaving between lanes, buses unloading crowds of people at every corner. Matthias opened his eyes just to make sure they were still moving. Through the window he saw the sea glistening, turquoise blue and peaceful, a cruel irony to what was going on inside his body. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the taxi stopped in front of a large white building. Hospital Naval de Cartagena was written in blue letters above the entrance. Matthias threw a bill at the driver without waiting for change and stumbled out of the car. His legs almost gave way as he climbed the stairs to the emergency room. The lobby was crowded. Families sat on plastic chairs, children cried, an old woman was wheeled past on a stretcher. The smell of disinfectant mingled with sweat and something sweet that Matthias couldn't identify. He staggered to the reception desk, where a nurse in a light blue uniform stared bored at a computer screen. "Ayúdame," he managed to say. "Help me, por favor." The nurse looked up, her face expressionless. "¿Qué te pasa? What's wrong with you?" Matthias tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could he say that his body was infested with larvae? Instead, he pulled up his shirt, pointed to his stomach, then lower. The nurse frowned, stood up, and called for someone. A doctor arrived, young, with tired eyes, and a stethoscope around his neck. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez and led Matthias into a small examination room. The walls were stained, the couch covered with green paper that rustled with every movement. Matthias sat down, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Muestra me," Dr. Ramirez said calmly. "Show me." Matthias hesitated, then pulled down his pants. Dr. Ramirez stepped closer, put on latex gloves and bent down. His face changed. The tiredness disappeared, replaced by a mixture of fascination and disgust. He muttered something in Spanish, too fast for Matthias to understand, and reached for a small lamp. The light burned on Matthias's skin, and he saw what the doctor saw. The redness had spread, the swelling had gotten worse, and the larvae, those little white worms, were now moving more slowly, as if they had eaten their fill. Dr. Ramirez took a pair of tweezers, carefully pulled out one of the larvae, and placed it in a small plastic dish. The thing was still wriggling. "Meiosis," Dr. Ramirez finally said, more to himself than to Matthias. Then in English, with a strong accent, "You have fly larvae. This is serious." Matthias's breath caught in his throat. How did this happen?" Dr. Ramirez looked at him, his eyes now sharp and probing. "Have you had sex with someone here?" Matthias nodded, ashamed, frightened. The doctor sighed deeply. "It happens sometimes. Not often, but it happens. Certain flies lay eggs in warm, moist environments. If someone has poor hygiene or lives in an area with a lot of flies, the larvae can be transmitted during intimate contact." Matthias felt his stomach turn. He leaned to the side and vomited into a trash can. Dr. Ramirez put a hand on his shoulder and waited until he was finished. "We have to remove them, all of them, and then antibiotics to prevent infection. It will be painful, but it is necessary." Matthias nodded silently. He had no strength left to speak, to think, to feel. He just let himself fall back onto the couch and stared at the ceiling while Dr. Ramirez prepared the instruments. Somewhere in the distance he heard sirens, voices, life going on while his was shattering into 1,000 pieces. Dr. Ramirez worked methodically, almost mechanically. First, he injected a local anesthetic, small pricks that Matthias barely noticed through the fog of pain and shock. Then he began to pull out the larvae one by one with tweezers. Each time he removed one, he placed it in the plastic tray, where they still moved weakly before finally lying still. Matthias stared at the ceiling and tried to be somewhere else. In Dortmund, in his workshop, where the worst day was just a broken engine or a dissatisfied customer, but his body wouldn't let him forget where he really was. Every pull of the tweezers felt like something was being torn out of him that didn't belong there. And that was true. "How many are there?" he asked in a broken voice. Dr. Ramirez didn't look up. "Maybe 40, 50. Some are deeper. We'll have to treat those differently." 40. The word echoed in Matthias's head. 40 living organisms that had eaten their way into his flesh. He closed his eyes and breathed through his mouth to keep from vomiting again. After half an hour that felt like an eternity, Dr. Ramirez stepped back and took off his gloves. He washed his hands thoroughly, dried them, and sat down on a stool next to the couch. His face was serious, tired, but not without compassion. "Most of them are out. Some will die on their own with the antibiotics I'm prescribing you. You have to keep the wound clean, very clean. Wash it twice a day with antiseptic solution. No sexual activity for at least 3 weeks. And you have to come back in 4 days for a checkup." Matthias nodded mechanically. 4 days. He didn't want to stay in this country for another 4 hours. Dr. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice becoming quieter, more insistent. "You have to tell me who that woman was. It's not just important for you. If she lives in such a way that flies can lay eggs in her body, then she's a danger to other men, maybe even to herself." Matthias opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? He didn't know her last name, didn't know exactly where she lived. He only remembered the dilapidated building, the squeaky door, the sweet smell. I know her name. Gabriela. That's all." Dr. Ramirez sighed. That's not enough. The police must be informed. This is a public health issue. The police! Matthias's heart began to race. No, I don't want to go to the police. I just want to go home. That's not an option. The doctor stood up and left the room before Matthias could protest. 10 minutes later, a police officer entered the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that was too tight and showed dark sweat stains under his armpits. His name tag read Teniente Vargas. He had a notebook in his hand and a pen, which he tapped absent-mindedly against his palm. "Senor Keller," he said in broken English, "you need to tell me what happened, everything." Matthias told the story, haltingly, ashamed. The bar, Gabriela, the apartment, the night. Vargas took notes, occasionally interrupting him with questions. What did she look like? How old? What was she wearing? Were there other people in the apartment? With each question, Matthias felt smaller, stupider. He was a 44-year-old man who had allowed himself to be seduced by a strange woman in a strange city without taking even the most basic precautions. No condom, no questions, no common sense. Vargas closed his notebook and looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "This happens here more often than you think," he said. "Cartagena is beautiful, but it also has a dark side. Women living in extreme poverty, in houses without sanitation, without windows. Flies lay eggs there, everywhere, and when these women are desperate enough, they use their bodies to survive, even if it's infected." Matthias swallowed hard. Did she know that she had it? Vargas shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. Sometimes they don't feel it until it's too late, or they ignore it because they don't have money for a doctor, or they don't care. He pulled a business card from his breast pocket and placed it on the couch next to Matthias. "If you remember anything else, call me. We'll try to find her, but without more information." He left the sentence unfinished, and the meaning was clear. It was unlikely. Vargas left the room, leaving Matthias alone. He took the business card, stared at the phone number, and then put it in his pants pocket. He wouldn't call. He wanted nothing more to do with this city, with this woman, with this nightmare. Dr. Ramirez returned with a bag full of medication. Antibiotics, painkillers, antiseptic solution. He explained everything again, slowly, so that Matthias would understand. Then he helped him off the couch, supporting him when his legs gave way again. "Rest, drink plenty of water, and come back if the pain gets worse or if you develop a fever." Matthias nodded and left the hospital, clutching the bag tightly in his hand. Outside, it was now noon. The sun was blazing high in the sky, and the city continued to pulsate, indifferent to his suffering. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of his hotel. The driver nodded and drove off without asking any questions. In the taxi, Matthias stared out the window and saw Cartagena with new eyes. The colorful houses now looked faded, the laughing people strange, the music too loud. He had imagined finding a break here, maybe even a piece of himself. Instead, he had lost something he would never get back. His trust, his innocence, his dignity. The hotel room became Matthias's prison. He only left it to buy water and bread at the small shop on the corner, his eyes always downcast, as if every passerby could see what had happened to him. The shop owner, an older man with a friendly smile, tried to strike up a conversation every time, but Matthias just muttered, "Gracias," and fled back to his room. The first 2 days were the worst. The pain was constant, a burning throbbing that couldn't be ignored. He took the painkillers Dr. Ramirez had given him, but they only dulled the edge. At night, he lay awake, staring at the spinning ceiling fan, feeling his mind return again and again to that night. Gabriela's face, her smile, the way she had taken his hand. Had she known? Had she planned it? He tried to call his daughter Laura, but hung up before she could answer. What would he say to her? that her father, who had always preached to her to be careful, to be sensible, had behaved like an idiot in a strange city. She was 16, old enough to understand, but he couldn't bear the thought of her seeing him that way. On the third day, the fever started. It came on suddenly, a chill running through his whole body, followed by a heat that felt like he was burning from the inside. He pulled the blanket over his head and tried to sleep, but sleep came only in short, restless waves, filled with nightmares of crawling things and Gabriella's cold, expressionless gaze. When he woke up the next morning, his pillow was soaked with sweat. He fumbled for his cell phone and saw that it was the fourth day, the day he was supposed to go back to the hospital. His body screamed to stay in bed, but a quiet voice in his head, the voice of reason that hadn't completely disappeared, told him he had to go. He struggled to get dressed, the clothes feeling strange against his feverish skin. In the mirror, he saw a man he barely recognized. His eyes were sunken, dark circles beneath them, his face pale despite the Caribbean sun. He had lost maybe 5 kilos in 4 days. The taxi ride to the hospital felt like a repeat, only this time everything was slower, more blurred. The driver said something, but Matthias only heard a buzzing sound. When they arrived, he paid double without realizing it. Dr. Ramirez wasn't there. Instead, he was greeted by a young doctor, Dr. Silva, with short black hair and a serious face. She led him into the same examination room, and Matthias lay down on the couch, too exhausted to feel ashamed. She examined him silently, her gloves cool against his hot skin. After a few minutes, she stepped back and took off her gloves. Her face was tense. "You have an infection. The wound is inflamed, and your fever is too high. I have to keep you here at least 2 days, maybe longer. Intravenous antibiotics." Matthias just nodded. He had no strength left to fight. Dr. Silva called a nurse, who put him in a wheelchair and pushed him through long, sterile corridors. The walls were white, bare, and the neon lights flickered occasionally. Somewhere a child was crying, and the smell of disinfectant stung his nose. They took him to a shared room, 3 other beds, 2 of them occupied. An older man with a bandaged leg, muttering quietly to himself, and a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, lying with his eyes closed, an oxygen mask over his face. Matthias got the bed by the window. The view wasn't much. A parking lot, a few palm trees swaying in the wind. The nurse inserted an IV needle into his arm, tied it down, and hung a bag of clear fluid on the stand next to the bed. "This will help," she said in Spanish, slowly enough for him to understand. Rest. Matthias closed his eyes and sank into the thin pillows. The steady drip of the IV became a rhythm, almost soothing. He drifted into a restless half-sleep where reality and dreams blurred together. Hours later, when the sun was already low and bathed the room in orange light, he woke up. The young man in the bed opposite was gone, the bed freshly made. The old man was still asleep, his breathing rattling. Matthias fumbled for his cell phone and saw that he had 3 missed calls from his ex-wife. She only called when it was about Laura. He called back, his voice hoarse. "Hello, Matthias. Where are you?" Laura's voice sounded worried on the other end. "Dad said you were away, but you're not answering my messages." Matthias swallowed. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm fine, I'm just busy. You sound strange. Are you sick?" "A little. Nothing serious. How are you?" She told him about school, about a test she had passed, about a boy who had asked her out on a date. Matthias listened and tried to say the right things, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw the larvae in front of him, felt Gabriella's hand on his, heard Dr. Ramirez say, 40, 50. "Dad," Laura's voice brought him back. "Are you still there?" Yes, I'm here. When are you coming home?" "Soon, very soon." When he hung up, he felt the tears coming, quiet, hot, and he let them flow because no one was looking. On his second day in the hospital, Lieutenant Vargas appeared unexpectedly in his room. He was wearing the same tight uniform, this time with a file folder under his arm. The old man in the next bed was snoring loudly, and Vargas pulled the curtain between the beds to create some privacy. "We found her," he said without preamble. "Gabriela Moreno. That's her real name." Matthias sat up with difficulty, the IV cable pulling on his arm. "And?" Vargas opened the folder and pulled out a photo. It was Gabriela, but different. Younger, perhaps, thinner, with clearer eyes. "She's sitting in the police station now. We found her in the same apartment where you were. The conditions there." He shook his head. "No windows, trash everywhere, mold on the walls. The health department closed the building immediately." Matthias felt his stomach tighten. Did she know that she was infected? Vargas leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "She says she didn't know, claims she sometimes had itching, but thought it was normal in the heat. No education, no money for doctors." He paused. "But here's the problem. You're not the first." Matthias's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "There have been 3 other cases in the last 8 months, all tourists, all men, all with the same diagnosis. Myiasis, one from Spain, one from Canada, one from Argentina. All had contact with the same woman, 3 others. The words echoed in Matthias's head. "Why didn't you stop her sooner?" Vargas's face hardened. "Because no one filed a complaint. The men were ashamed, just wanted to go home. We had reports from the hospitals, but no names, no details. Only now, with your case, were we able to make the connection." Matthias closed his eyes. 4 men, 4 lives she had ruined, whether intentionally or out of ignorance. What will happen to her now? She's being treated. The larvae were removed from her too, over 100 of them. Then there will be an investigation to determine whether there will be criminal consequences. Negligence, perhaps, but proving that she did it intentionally. Vargas shrugged. "That will be difficult." Matthias opened his eyes and looked directly at Vargas. "I don't want to see her again, ever. You don't have to. But you have to make an official statement for the record. Just the facts." Vargas placed a form on the bed. Matthias signed it with a trembling hand, without reading it. When the police officer left the room, only the photo remained on the bedside table. Matthias stared at it, at Gabriela's face, and tried to understand. Was she a monster, or just a victim of circumstances, trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair? He took the photo and slowly tore it into small pieces. It didn't matter anymore. What was done was done. All he had to do now was get home and try to put the pieces of his life back together. 3 days later, Matthias was discharged from the hospital. The infection was under control, the fever had disappeared, and the wounds were beginning to heal. Dr. Silva gave him one last prescription for antibiotics and a list of instructions. "Keep it clean, no exertion. And when you get back to Germany, see a doctor immediately for a follow-up checkup." Matthias nodded, took the papers, and left the hospital for the last time. The heat outside hit him like a slap in the face, but this time it no longer felt inviting. It was just heat, oppressive and indifferent. He had brought his return flight forward to the next day. The original plan had been to stay another week, visit the Rosario Islands, maybe take a trip to Santa Marta. But now he just wanted to get away. Back to Dortmund, where everything was familiar, where no one knew him as the man to whom this had happened. At the hotel, he packed his things mechanically. He threw the clothes he had worn that night in the trash. He couldn't even look at them without feeling sick. When he left the room, he didn't look back once. The airport was chaotic, full of families flying off on vacation, full of laughter and excitement. Matthias sat in a corner, his backpack clutched tightly to his lap, waiting for his boarding call. Next to him sat a young couple, perhaps in their mid-20s, poring over a map of Cartagena and making excited plans. The man pointed to Gethsemane and said something about the best bar in town. Matthias closed his eyes and tried to block out their voices. The flight was long and agonizing. Matthias hardly slept. Every movement in his seat hurt, and his thoughts revolved endlessly around the same questions. Could he have seen the signs? The locked door, the sweet smell, Gabriella's strangely distant manner. But at that moment, drunk on aguardiente and the illusion of connection, he hadn't wanted to see anything. When the plane landed in Frankfurt, he breathed deeply for the first time in days. The air was cool, almost cold compared to Cartagena, and the sky was grey. It felt right. He took the train to Dortmund, staring out the window at the passing German landscape, which looked so orderly and predictable. Small villages, neat fields, highways stretching straight through the hills. Nothing unexpected, nothing dangerous. When he arrived home, he stood in front of his apartment door for a long time, key in hand. It felt strange to be back, as if he had travelled not only through space, but also through time. When he opened the door, the familiar smell hit him. Coffee, motor oil, the detergent he always used. He dropped his backpack and sank onto the couch. The next morning he went to see his family doctor, Dr. Brenner, an older man with grey hair and a reassuring manner, as promised. Matthias told the story, this time without the embarrassing details, just the medical facts. Dr. Brenner listened, examined him thoroughly, and then shook his head. You were lucky, Matthias. If the infection had spread further, if you had waited another day. He left the sentence unfinished. I'll prescribe another week of antibiotics, and you'll come back for a checkup in 10 days. And please, he said with a look that understood more than Matthias had told him, take better care of yourself in the future. The days passed slowly. Matthias went back to work in the workshop, but he wasn't the same. His colleagues noticed it and asked if everything was okay, if he had enjoyed his vacation. He lied and said it was okay, but he was glad to be back home. They accepted that and left him alone. In the evenings he often sat alone in his apartment, a beer in his hand, staring into space. The scars on his body were healing, slowly but steadily, but the scars in his mind felt deeper, incurable. He still dreamed of Gabriella, of the larvae, of the heat, and the feeling of being completely helpless. 2 weeks after his return, Laura called. She wanted to visit him over the weekend, and he said yes, even though part of him didn't want her to see him like this, broken and empty. But when she arrived, with her bright laughter and carefree attitude, he felt something like hope for the first time since Cartagena. They sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, and Laura talked about school, her friends, the boy who had asked her out on a date. Matthias listened and smiled, and for a moment he almost forgot what had happened. Are you sure you're okay, Dad? She asked suddenly, her eyes serious and searching. You look different, thinner and sad. Matthias hesitated, then placed a hand on hers. I've had a hard time, he admitted, but it's getting better. A little bit every day. Laura nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. If you want to talk, I'm here. I'm not a child anymore. I know, he said quietly. I know. After she left, Matthias remained sitting in the kitchen, thinking about Gabriella, about the 3 other men who had gone through the same thing, about the thousands of people who made decisions every day that changed their lives forever. Was she guilty? Had he been naive? Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. One day, weeks later, he received an email from Teniente Vargas. The investigation was complete. Gabriela Moreno had been sentenced to 2 years probation for negligent bodily injury and had to undergo regular medical examinations. She was no longer allowed to offer sexual services. The apartment had been permanently closed. Matthias read the email twice, then deleted it. It was over. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but over. Months passed. The physical wounds healed completely, without lasting damage, as Dr. Brenner had assured him. The emotional ones took longer. Matthias stopped going out, avoided bars, avoided strangers. He focused on his work, on Laura, on the small, predictable joys of life. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he thought back to that night in Cartagena, to Gabriela's hand in his, to the feeling of connection that had turned out to be an illusion. He had been looking for freedom, for a new beginning, and instead he had found something that had almost destroyed him. But he had survived, and in a strange, twisted way, that was enough.